Thank you so much for joining us once again. My name is Mitterand Okore. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow attached to the program When the Law is Not Enough, Intractable Problems of Human Rights in Africa. And joining us today is Dr. Stella Bosire from Kenya. Okay, welcome, welcome, Dr. Stella. Okay, for those who may not know, Dr. Stella is a Kenyan medical doctor who has used her medical experience to advocate for the health of sex workers and sexual and gender minorities. She is currently the director of African Center for Gender and Health System. Formerly, she was co-executive director of UHAI, East African and Health Rights Initiative. The organization is Africa's first indigenous activist-led and managed fund. And it issues grants to civil society organizations working with sex workers and sexual and gender minorities across 7 East and Central African countries. The organization supports and influences laws and policies through, amongst others, funding court processes seeking to reverse repressive laws, such as the successful overturning of the 2014 Uganda's Anti-Homosexuality Act. In 2019, Dr. Stella was awarded the Commonwealth Point of Light Award for her work on championing the rights of the most vulnerable people in society. She was also awarded the 2019 Accountability International Leadership Award. Dr. Stella is also a 2018 Aspen Institute New Voices Fellow. Quite a very stellar CV there, Doctor. We are so happy that you could make our time to join us today. Before today, we have had sessions on child labor. We have had sessions on human trafficking. So for the next 2 sessions, with your starting, we will be looking at protection for LGBTQIA+ rights in our continent. And we are happy people like you who are on the front lines can share your experience with us today. Before moving forward, I would also like to introduce our program a little bit to you and for any other person joining us today. So for the first time. So I would like to call on one of our PIs, our principal investigator in the project, Dr. Toko Kaime, to briefly introduce the program to us, and afterwards, you can have the floor. Professor Toko.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me. My internet connection has not been so great this morning, but a special welcome to Stella. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us. This project on intractable problems of human rights tries to adopt a multidisciplinary look at issues in human rights that are very pressing, have been highly regulated, and yet the results are uncertain. And the topic that you will be discussing this morning certainly fits into this frame. We have a lot of international human rights normative standards guaranteeing protection from discrimination, guaranteeing equality, and yet for our members of the community who identify as LGBTQI+, we know that for them, the law means nothing. The standards do not deliver the kinds of protection that at face value the law seems to promise. And we are very interested in hearing from colleagues like you who've been working on the front lines of these questions, looking at the potential that the law has, but also understanding the limits of the law. Ultimately, the question is, what should we be doing better in order to deliver these protections? And essentially, the project is premised on this, that we have a good foundation in relation to the normative systems, but what can we do in order to deliver better protection, whether we're looking at issues around child labor, anti-racism, human trafficking, or issues relating to the protection of LGBTQI plus minorities. So with these few words, I'll hand over the floor to you. We're really privileged to spend this time with you, and looking forward to learning from you. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much. Let me also do a personal disclosure. Aside from working for the last 10 years working around sexual and gender minorities and other vulnerable population, I personally am a queer woman. My pronouns are she, her. And so this work for me is not just work around deliverance or trying to change, bringing societal impact, but it's also my own personal lived experience. And so when I speak from the heart, because this is also part of the experiences that I, as a queer woman, have gone through. Allow me to just put my video off so that you don't lose me. And anytime, Okoria, if you lose me, just let me know. If I speak very fast, because I speak very fast, let me know. And I'll be grateful. Fine, fantastic. Okay. I'll begin by just giving a little bit of a history of Kenya, the vibrant community there. LGBTIQ community. Actually, within the Eastern African region, we are one of the most vibrant, LGBTIQ. And the beautiful thing about our communal organizing is that we are intersectional. Intersectional, recognizing that we have community members who are sex workers, we have community members who are people living with disability, we have community members who are also persons who, for one reason or the other, ones are guests of the state, are either incarcerated, So we take an intersectional lens, and we also recognize our community members are also the youth. And so because of that, our activists have really made best use of our court system. And because this conversation is more about what we've learned about law, how we've utilized the laws and what we can do differently. But one of the biggest wins about the Kenyan community is that we've made good use of our national court system to really challenge a number of discriminatory policies and practices, including issues around more about what kind of laws that we have and how it is that they really impact the person at an individual level and also at the community. I also have to start by saying also the good things that we've been able to achieve over the past year. LGBTIQ persons could actually share of the organization. We've also had groundbreaking judgments around legal recognition. And I'm sure you've heard about the case of Audrey, where we've had she's a trans woman from Kenya. We've had her legal documents are legal. I don't know where you must have lost me from, but perhaps I'll just summarize 3 things I have mentioned about how we've used the courts in Kenya as the LGBTIQ. So discussing about the Baby A case, which was one of the really wins that we've had, because what it did is that it really gave a very good framework for healthcare providers, for parents to be able not to interfere with the health of the intersex children by not dictating what kind of medical interventions they've gone through. Another key win is actually the Audrey case around legal recognition, where her academic information was now where the government was actually forced by the courts to be able to change her academic papers, and which was very successful. The third one is around freedom of association, where now LGBTIQ organizations can actually formally register within the country. And so some of these wins are one of the reasons why we continue using the legal tool to be able to to claim the rights and freedoms that are being barred by other legislations like penal code. The other thing I wanted to mention that despite the wins that we've had, our norms continue to become a barrier for us, for the communities, you know, and this is really propagated by religion, propagated by culture. And if you're following the politics of Kenya, you will realize that our president has actually come out very clearly around human rights issues for sexual and gender minorities. And this is something that we are trying to organize ourselves around what strategies that we'll be able to take. The other issue is around what it looks like to be able to issues around freedom of liberty, you know, the prevention of liberty for intersex persons. It's a win that we have, that an intersex person can actually choose what, I mean, if they are facing a sentence, they can actually choose the kind, if they want to go to the male or the female jails. However, we still, sexual and gender minority persons can still not be able to adopt a child in the country. This is against our laws, the Children's Act. And so that is also something that the community is trying to push against within the challenges that we have. So let me now contextualize really what are the issues, the legal issues that are existing right now for LGBTIQ persons in Kenya. The continuation around criminalization of same-sex relationship. We have our penal code, provisions, section 162 and 165, which criminalizes same-sex relationship, and actually a penalty to it is the penalty carries a 14-year maximum sentence to that. For those who are following, what has been happening is that a couple of years ago, the community went to court, and in 2019 we got a judgment, which was a very heartbreaking judgment, because the court rejected the petitioner's argument, claiming that the penal code provisions were not unconstitutional and did not infringe on the right to privacy, freedom of expression, human dignity, right to health, and protection against any discrimination. As I speak, you will realize that this was a very misplaced judgment, based on the fact that very issues that they're saying that are not in terms of marriage, and it only defines a cis-heterosexual relationship. And so this also is another barrier that exists, where the right to even form a family has been rejected by the right. So some of the laws, statutory laws that talk about bankruptcy, and particularly around impersonation for trans-identifying person, and we continue to see a lot of them being arrested, you know. I mean, because of existence of these laws, what we're witnessing within the country is like there's a lot of blackmail and extortion against the LGBTIQ communities, you know, from either the public, the police, and even from their family members, you know, in the fear of exposing them and outing them. For those LGBTIQ persons who also earn their living through sex works, there's also another layer of legal legislations that bar them and attack them. And this is bylaws which exist within the different counties. Like, for example, the Nairobi County, there's a bylaw that prohibits sex work, you know, which was from 2007. And what happens is most of them are either arrested, they're extorted, they are even some have reported cases of sexual harassment and sexual assault when in the hands of the police. The other challenge that the community faces is sexual and gender-based violence based on either perceived or real sexual orientation or gender identity. We've seen particularly around conversion therapy by use of RIP as a tool for LBQ women. The response to SDBV around the community has been low, particularly because the providers are very discriminatory. Law enforcement was supposed to even offer what we call here as a P3, which is an important form in terms of access to justice and access to services. Is something that they are not easily given, the community is not easily given, and of course that also hampers access to justice. There's also an issue around femicide. Just this year, towards the mid this year, we lost a young queer woman who identified as a cis lesbian woman, who was gang raped and mutilated, you know. And it really arose a lot of emotions in the whole country, really asking about questioning issues of security, questioning issues of human rights around LBQ women who, particularly within the household and the communal setup, lots of human rights violations are occurring in the hands of the community. Of course, because of this, the impact to trauma, the confounding issues around psychological and psychiatric trauma that they face is also not being responded to. And this has an implication around the mental health burden that they cause around in their lives, which also now disproportionately affects them as compared to the other population. The other issues around torture, cruel and degrading treatment. Because of lack of legal frameworks which are protective for LGBTIQ persons, they are constantly faced with inhumane and degrading treatment, predisposing them to treatment. And most of this inhumane treatment is driven, most of this inhumane treatment is driven by law enforcement agencies, religious leaders, public officers, and even the media, and that's something that has been we have highlighted over the years the role of the media, particularly in fueling discrimination and attracting violence to the queer community. There's also extortion, what I talked about, and intimidation by state officer, often by family members, by the police, and who even go as far as threatening them to lose their employment at their workplaces. Arbitrary arrest and unlawful detention is also very rampant in the country, and particularly within rural areas or informal settlement areas. There's also use of excessive and unlawful force by law enforcement agents, and unfortunately, even when they have had injuries, healthcare, they hardly even access healthcare for them to be able to mitigate some of the health issues that come out as a consequence of that. The other issue around the community is around access to health as a right. It's known globally over around the disproportionate burden of HIV, TB, STIs, including hepatitis B and hepatitis C among the LGBTIQ community, and particularly looking at GBMSM, gay men, bisexual men, men who have sex with men, and also transgender women. And with this recognition, the existence of criminalizing laws really forced the community to go underground. The propagation of violence and further stigma and discrimination by healthcare workers makes it even worse for them to be able to access care. In fact, before the first annual examination case, before it was declared unconstitutional, what would happen is that the police would actually use healthcare workers to tell them about homosexual persons. The healthcare worker would call the police to come and arrest them. So that was a tactic that was used for a long period of time by healthcare workers to tell on LGBTIQ community members who accessed care. Mental health, 18% more prevalent within the LGBTIQ communities as compared to the other. And this includes depression, this includes anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicide. And this is something that we, as of this year, I think we've lost more than 3 members of the community because they died because of suicide. There's also issues around access to health information for LGBTIQ persons. A number of laws have come into the country, Data Protection Act, computer misuse, which have actually targeted the community. And there was also a policy that had been introduced, which was looking at biometrics, to identify and map where the community is. And this was very dangerous, particularly in the hands of wrong people. And the community even had to forfeit accessing care because of issues of infringement of their privacy and confidential information. I cannot not mention issues around social determinants of health because the community is disproportionately affected. If you think about poverty, so I think I'd mentioned the issues of some of the struggles, despite the existence of constitution. So I was talking about if you look at the disproportionate way in which the LGBTIQ communities are affected, if you're talking about mental health, if you're talking about HIV, if you're talking about hepatitis B, hepatitis C, tuberculosis, and now we are actually seeing an increase in malignancies, around cervical cancer for LBQ women, who, because of stigma and discrimination, are not able to access the screening, and early diagnosis. We are seeing an increase in malignancies around trans, particularly those who have not undergone through any gender affirming care, surgery, or access to hormonal therapy through a practitioner. We are starting to see the number of cancers that are coming up, of discrimination the healthcare. And yet we have a provision and a legal provisions in Article 43 that talks about everyone having the right to the highest attainable standard of health. Indeed, as you said, that it is not just the legal provisions that are going to be enough for us to be able to address some of these critical issues, either when you're talking about torture, sexual and gender-based violence issues, you're talking about access to health as a right, when you're talking about criminalizing laws, and all the intersectional issues, particularly now when you start introducing sub-vulnerabilities around disability, sub-vulnerabilities around geographical locations, class issues, those ones are even compound and make the oppression, the oppression and also the exposure to the risks a little more. So really what can be done to enhance protection of the existing legal frameworks, because we have one of the most progressive constitutions and some statutory provisions in this continent. Number one is around those who offer services. When I talk about services, it's not just healthcare services. You're thinking about law enforcement agencies. They have to be trained around a human-based rights approach, in delivering the services. Even if a person there's a claim to a person that they have committed a crime or something, there has to be a way in which that the person whose liberty are perhaps on threat can actually be handled in the hands of the law enforcement areas. That the issues of sexual harassment, the issues of physical, verbal, emotional violence that they are facing within the hands of either healthcare workers, the law enforcement areas, the other judiciary caregivers, judiciary officers. This is something that should be able to be addressed. When you think about addressing health issues, you cannot have a singular way in which you're addressing about medical interventions. You have to realize that for LGBTIQ persons, that it actually goes beyond the medical issue. It has to take into account the other social issues that affect them in terms of access to care, availability, uptake, accessibility, and even affordability. And look at all these factors and look at what are the social barriers to them. Are you talking about legal and legal policy frameworks? Are you talking about social norms? Address those social norms within community levels. And so that is also another strategy that the community really needs a lot of awareness around human rights issues, around the violence. And one of the strategies that I've seen being used and I have used in the work that I've done is approaching LGBTIQ rights, getting from a societal protection and safeguarding perspective, thinking around we are to safeguard, and protect everyone from any kind of disease, from any kind of violence, from any kind of intimidation, from abuse of office, particularly by state officers like law enforcement or those who are involved in the judiciary, because these are usually the common culprits, thinking about that, So training programs for these state officers is mandatory, for facilities, expand care so that it's not a binary cis-lens perspective that people are accessing care, because that's exactly what's happening. Our healthcare systems are very binary. Offer care for SGPV that is very expansive, that is very gender inclusive, that it takes into account the distinct needs of trans-identifying persons, distinct needs for LBQ women, distinct needs for gay men and gay, bisexual, and men who have sex with men. The other thing that also something that that we are seeing right now, that even with the first annual exam judgment, which was favorable to the community, we're still seeing police officers, healthcare workers, administrative officers really still weaponizing that. And there has to be like an accountability context. And so we have to really invest in civil society organizations, one, as champions of human rights, two, as shadows in terms of shadowing performance of, and particularly human rights performance, and here you're talking about UPR mechanisms around human rights violations for communities who are vulnerable. And that is something that you be able, because you can use these documents, this data, this evidence in the courts of law to be able to continue claiming the rights and freedoms and for all LGBTQ persons. So I will stop there in terms of just giving an overview so that I can take questions and I can dig a little bit deeper into that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stella, for such a wonderful talk. We do understand that there can be network hitches, but despite that, we did hear you loud and clear. So thank you so much for this contribution and being in the forefront of fighting about what it means to be human. Even though we are all we may be all different in our orientation. Please, the floor is open. We are welcome to ask Dr. Stella any question regarding her expertise or her talk today. Feel free to ask your question in the chat if you do not wish to speak. Otherwise, you can raise your hands and you will be asked to unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, while we wait for others, I do have a question myself, Doctor. I just want to know if your network, if the LGBTQ plus network in Africa, in terms of people who do the work you do, who rally against these very draconian laws, if it is there's some kind of transnational solidarity. In some countries things are much worse, like in Nigeria, where I come from. It's more draconian over there. It's much more people are catching hell, if I could use that expression. So is there a sort of synergy? Do organizations in LGBTQ organizations in different countries, do you like coalesce, kind of share strategies, on how to go about advocacy, on how to assist people in the community? Is there this interaction, learning from each other and learning strategies from which to operate, within different countries?
Yes, indeed, there are. So what the community has done, that despite their existing in-country movements and organizing, is that there's also formed coalitions within the African continent. So you have called the Coalition of African Lesbians, you have the African Trans Network, you have the Intersex, the Association of Intersex Movement. So all these existence of these movements is to be able to, number one, share best practices, peer-to-peer support in some of the different issues that you're facing. And I'll give you an example of what's happening within the East Africa community, is that now we are developing the reproductive health bill. So what the community has done is that it's given representations, they've come together, put together resources, and now they've even contributed to some of to the bill, which has had introduced some of the draconian issues that we're trying to fight against. And so the community came together, in solidarity. And we have institutions like ARASA, institutions like ISLA, who are very big around legal issues, particularly ISLA. And so ISLA has been able to bring together most of the organizations that work around legal and policy frameworks to be able to, capacity build them, to give them the tools to be able to direct them to create spaces, if they're convening spaces, to create opportunities for them in terms of publications, documentation about human rights issues. And so this is something that I see very big within the continent, but also just thinking about how, in terms of activist movements have organized within the Eastern African region, 7 countries, you have the UHAI being able to resource movements to be able to do this work. In the West African region now we have ISDAO. In the Southern African region we have the other foundations. So even coalescing resources around some of these intermediary activist funds has also been very critical, because legal processes are not cheap, they're very expensive. And so if to be able to fund some of this work, then it needs the community to actually access resources which are flexible in nature. And so some of the strategies around the community is around safeguarding resources, around capacity building, ensuring that their networks are very strong, and also scaling up their advocacy beyond just the regional level there, if it's West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, the Northern African region, the Arab region, and scaling up some of the work that they do all to the global level using the UPR mechanisms. And I find that these are very important tools that are able to actually highlight some of the human rights violations, even in international forum around issues around economics. And now you're seeing the World Bank really centralizing some of its interventions in terms of investments within the continent from a human rights perspective. And those are critical strategies that have actually come out because of the community involvement. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Toko, please go on.
Okay, Stella, thank you for these insights. I wanted to hear from you your perspective about some of these unsuccessful cases. You've highlighted a few from Kenya. You are aware of many others from across the continent. And my question is this: what is the impact of these attempts to force recognition of these rights that ultimately end up failing, in the high court and the superior court? Is this damaging for the overall movement, or does it still serve to highlight the kinds of pressures that this community is facing from the legal system?
I look at it from a double-edged sword, right? That in one moment, cutting fat piece of meat for me to enjoy. In other moments, if I'm not very careful, I'm actually going to be cut and I'm going to be harmed, And these are the reasons. I'll give you an example around Repeal 160 to 165, the Kenyan one, around the penal code provisions, which I will still believe they are very unconstitutional. The visibility of the movement, it's just not nationally. It was within the continent, it was internationally, and you saw even international media picking up these stories and speaking about it. That's the first thing, increasing visibility. This is a movement that for a long period of time, if you look at it, 15 years ago, it was completely underground. Nobody was, people organized, people held spaces, community spaces underground, and now they can actually access the courts. That's a very huge win. The second win is that because of the critical issues that are being addressed, which are human rights issues, and sexual orientation, gender identity, I keep saying that these are just excuses that are used to weaponize and to harm the community, is we have seen the establishment of the special rapporteur of human rights, and particularly on issues of LGBTIQ, speaking openly, about what was happening in Ghana, what was happening in Kenya, the sexual offences bill that was happening in that was almost passed, but the lobbying, the community really worked very hard in Uganda. When the late Magufuli was attacking LGBTIQ community members in Tanzania, you actually see there was a huge resource movement to the community, to be able to continue funding this work. Because, I keep saying that there are multiple levels of courts. If the Supreme Court fails, you go to the East African Community Court. If that fails, we have at the African Union, we have the African mechanisms, around the African Court of Justice. If that fails, we have the international courts. We have multiple ways in which these issues can be addressed. And of course, either of those levels, they are resource intensive, both human resource and financial resource. And so that has to be really funded. Number two, the other thing that I feel like it also did, and I'll tell you what was experienced in Kenya, is that there was a lot of forced evictions for a lot of queer people from their homes where they had rented, because they were exposed, they were outed, and because now it gave the religious people, the people who are perpetuating cultural protection, to really target them. And lots of research. In fact, there is an institution called the Kenya Christian Association, a professional association that did a very bogus study, because it does not, for me as a scientist, in terms of metrics of research, really, and it was looking at the attitudes of Kenyans, or the knowledge, or rather attitudes of Kenyans around issues of abortion and LGBTIQ, and compounding them together, because it's a very contentious issues around body autonomy and integrity in my country. And so the product or the results of their study really was just to fuel this more. And these people are very tactful, around the time the judgment was released, because if you look at the judgment, it literally specifically mentions, this is a country where our religious beliefs do not, we are bound by our religious and cultural beliefs, and they use that up to do that. But you also look at an increase in anti-gender, anti-rights, global north evangelicals, the fundamentalists, they have flooded money to the politicians. So you will hear during the campaign period some of these politicians bringing out issues of, we cannot allow homosexuality within our continent, within our country, and this is like it's a ripple effect. It starts in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda. It's like we share, and that's why having a communal platform where we convene, like I know there's an institution that convenes every 2 years activists and human rights defenders within the region, is something that has happened. And so this money that is coming, that is actually really trying to trying to just disrupt the movement, disrupt the gains that you've had, and to continue creating the hate, and perpetuate violence and oppression against LGBTIQ. So looking at it from different lenses, you would actually see some of the examples. Those are just a few examples of some of the outcomes. Or there's also a new thing that is happening around, is that reintroduction of also a very harmful statutory, legislations. For example, we have a PBO bill that is supposed to police how much money comes to civil society organizations. And of course, here they are targeting those ones we are controversial, those ones who work in abortion, LGBTIQ rights, and human trafficking. They target around that, but it's something that we've been pushing against and which has failed. The Data Protection Act and computer misuse is also something that is being used frequently, and anti-abortion, bills and legislations are used against the community. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this comprehensive insight. Thank you, Stella.
I have another question.
Yes.
And it is around the work that the different LGBTQ plus communities or organizations rather are doing in Africa. Organizations such as yours. In my own countries, and I assume everywhere else, there is a lot of stigma, ostracization. People who bring themselves to fight for these rights, to change things. They come under a lot of pressure. Physical violence, discrimination. The next speaker we are going to have, actually Pamela, whom I'm very familiar with her work. She made what is essentially the first lesbian film, in Nigeria, and it was banned by the government. So I'm just trying to say there is a lot of work from African LGBT organizations trying to influence things from within. Now, here is the question I have. And what do you think, when presidents or international bodies, like IMF or presidents of Western countries try to tell African governments, we wouldn't give you loans unless you change so and so laws? Does that kind of weaken the position of African change makers who are trying to change things from within? Does it give voice to the facts or the counter? Does it give voice to the counter voices in the continent who then start saying, oh, this is being pushed from outside Africa. This is a Western project. Does it weaken the effort that is being made, by Africans to actually change things in Africa, to actually use our own resources and strategies to change things? Or do you think, we need every voice? So I would, it's something I kind of think about. So I would like to hear your opinion on it.
I think, and this is why when I look at legislations, when I look at the extent to which we can be influenced either by international or local, I feel like one of the biggest tools that we have in country, because that's where the lived experiences are within the country, just thinking about how we can leverage on the existing laws, that exist, if the inequality and non-discrimination, health, as a right, and other social and economic rights, I feel like there's a huge opportunity for us to leverage on what already exists in terms of low-lying fruits. And that's why you're seeing a lot of wins. You saw the win in Botswana, the continued win in South Africa, the wins in Kenya, Uganda. You're seeing that because even while we want to leverage on international instruments that exist and amazing universal health coverage, CEDAW, you can mention all of them, the thing is, we have to start from home, and starting from home is actually using what we have. And that's why the courts have been very clear around pronunciation of this, that the biggest voice around some of the human rights issues you find at international spaces are people on the global north, is because first and foremost, these people already have the freedoms, you know, and the rights that us we're trying to get. I remember during our repeal 162, 165, I categorically told somebody in the media, international media, the community is not here saying that they want to provisions to marry each other. No, we're just saying decriminalize, you know, decriminalize these provisions. And so there are two things here. And so if we go towards following up what's happening, particularly in developed countries, and not all of them, because some of them are regressing, is that they're at a different level, legislatively, politically, lived realities, community uptake, you know, social norm change. They're at a different level. And so for us, we have to start with consuming what are our issues now? I mean, the movie, like the recent one in Nigeria and Rafiki in Kenya, which were banned, and it actually took the court to allow us to even watch it for 7 days, you know, is saying that we're producing our own content, we are telling our own stories, you know, our narratives are changing, and we are the ones who are driving the narratives. And even if you're coming here to speak to us and support that work, please decolonize that kind of thinking, and know that our approach has to be led by our own lived experience. Our approach has to be leveraged on culture, because not all culture is bad, you know. Culture mostly you know, in our instances, is very protective. So how do we leverage on that? So I feel like we have to maximize all the ways in which we can. I like the IMF body. I like the IMF strategy. I used it when what was happening with Magufuli. I went to DC and sat with some of the leaders. And then the questions were raised around human rights and you supporting health and education, while other people were being targeted. And some of those strategies are shadowed. I mean, the underground diplomacy, they worked very well, but they cannot be the ones that are leading, you know. The voice of the people has to lead.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks a lot for that answer. Let's see if there are any further. Okay, Isabel, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Dear Stella, thank you for your insightful presentation. I really enjoyed it. And okay, so I have two questions. You have mentioned different levels of advocacy, and I'm particularly interested in what role you would give to the regional and sub-regional level in fighting for the actual protection of LGBTIQ plus individuals. And the second question is, I would like to learn from you what your understanding of claiming your personal rights from an individual perspective means.
Let me start with the question around regional and sub-regional, you know. I mean, what we can the instruments or the spaces or the opportunities that we have right now. I'm sure you know about ACPHR and what happened around the observer status of the Coalition of African Lesbian. They lost that observer status when there was a change of guard. You know also about what is that, 275, that also speaks about the rights of the LGBTIQ, which has of recent really been pushed. This is at the African Union level, you know, and some of these challenges that we are seeing is because of leadership, you know, governance, and it's because we have not institutionalized some of these issues that we won't talk about. For instance, if we are going to institutionalize issues of non-discrimination, you know, we have to ask ourselves in the difference. If you're talking about gender, you know, because you also have a directorate of gender, you have a directorate with gender and youth. How is it that this is reflecting within the other directorates? If you're talking about issues around agriculture, and this is just adequate nutrition, and thus not necessarily for LGBTIQ, but also for all. You're looking at Agenda 2063 for the African Union, and you're asking yourself, where are the opportunities around economic development? Where are the opportunities around sustainable agriculture? Where are the opportunities around gender equality and youth involvement that we are not leveraging on to ensure that we safeguard the rights of the LGBTIQ persons, and also really building champions within the African Union? And I feel like that's one of the things that perhaps we've not been able to really leverage on at the regional mechanisms that exist. Having champions, you know, like the way we have champions around gender equality. We have men, you know, men for men. Even some of the leadership within the African Union who are very huge, very vocal around women's rights, you know, children's rights, people with living with disability. And so how is it that we can also use some of these strategies that have worked The other thing is also telling our stories within these spaces. We have CHOGAM, for example, which is when the Commonwealth presidents are meeting, finding space to be able to highlight some of the critical issues that we have in terms of papers, in terms of letters to the president, in building solidarity, in terms of even shaping how the agenda looks like, because if you're going to work from our country local level, coalesce all the way to the regional and to our economic blocks, then we have an opportunity to actually leverage on these mechanisms that we have in terms of solidarity to have one front and one voice in speaking about these issues. And the other thing also is looking at allies, allies within religion, allies within cultural arms of our society, allies within the political front, and asking how is it that we can have these people really as people who are propagating some of the issues that we are struggling that are facing the community. On your second issues around claiming personal rights, and I'll say this contextualizing it to Kenya, I have a right to healthcare, high standard of healthcare, including reproductive health. I have a right to education, right? I have a right to clean water, I have a right to being protected in terms of security, all these are they are codified. And so for me as an individual, if any of these rights is infringed, any of these rights is denied, then at a personal level, I have mechanisms in which I can claim some of these rights. I can go to court, I can lodge a complaint within the administrative leadership, I can speak to my community to actually now start pushing, at all levels, even from the household levels, and to start seeing how can some of my rights really that have been infringed be safeguarded within all levels of leadership and all levels of the community. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Sarah Witt, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Stella, for a wonderful presentation and some of the insights you shared during the QA. I kind of want to come back to the question of funding and the kind of challenge or challenges you face while working on the ground. I want to ask this question partly because, not so long ago, I was in Sudan and I made some observations. And then we also had a workshop where, activists from the continent came together to kind of talk about some of the challenges faced by activists on the ground. And one of the issues that came out really strongly was related to how, money moves, how, funding, the politics of getting access to funding, and the kind of competition that's, fueled by funders from outside the continent. So what is your experience and also reflection about this? Because, in some instances, some participants in the workshop shared, a situation where they just put at loggerheads as if they are not working on a common agenda because of the competition for funding. And some, biases in the way funders select an activist group, this kind of politics, apart from what Mitran said of how, the funders impose a certain kind of rule on states, but even within the activist community, these are not going on. So I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about that, what your experiences are, what challenges you face, that come from the people that give money.
I've been privileged to both be at the end of receiving funding as an implementer and at the end of the spectrum of being a funder, even though I work for an intermediary organization. And there's a thing around, and I'm going to describe how I used to describe it. You enter a room, you're a black queer person. First and foremost, by virtue of just your race, there's already a hiccup around trust, that you have to work 3 times, double, you know, to be able to access funding. You have to produce documents over documents over documents, you know, without regard to, for instance, the environment that you're working with within the community, you know. I mean, rights of registration just came the other day, you know, in 2016, 2019 rather, not very far, you know, and on freedom of association. And so somebody is asking you, give us an audit report, give us your certificate of registration. And so we must, so those are the things that I would hear I would experience in funding spaces that would make me step back as a funder and ask, what are the best ways in which we can be able to move resources, really shift power and transform communities in terms of what they're doing. And one of the things where I come from is that we actually removed those red tapes, you know, would look for other meaningful ways of, do you have a fiscal host? Are there better ways in which we can tranche the resources into small bits, but very regular, so that you can do the work for purposes of auditing, because there's also a back end responsibility for us is something, but also the around what kind of money are you giving, you know? And for me, I've always been a big proponent of, you cannot talk about legal and policy change, you know, shifts within the work that even we're discussing right now, if you don't give general support, core support, flexible and long-term, you know, multi-year kind of funding. Because I mean, legislative processes are very long and they're very tedious and they're very expensive and they have to be invested for a time. So you can't give 1 year and tell somebody come and apply next year. That's very impossible. So that's one of the things that I've actually nuanced in spaces. And I've been privileged to sit in a group like the Global Philanthropic Organization, the East Africa Philanthropic Network, the Africa Philanthropic Network, where I bring those things to the table. And it's not just about the community, it's actually about funding, you know, within